week we are focusing on legislation. Now, before you think, oh no, not statutory interpretation again, Nicola's going to teach us all about the purposive approach. We're actually going to be doing much more than that.
This week we will be looking at two very different things. The first is looking at noting up legislation. So this is an advanced research skill set that you didn't encounter in Introduction to Law because we didn't want to overwhelm you with all the different things that you could do on the databases like Westlaw AU and Lexis Advance. Noting up legislation involves identifying what cases have cited and interpreted and applied certain provisions of legislation. So this will be very useful when you're trying to ascertain what the law is and how the legislation has been interpreted and applied. So in relation to your client interview and your letter of advice to a client, the first set of assessment in this unit, you will be looking at an area of law that you've not encountered before. You will need to use your research skills to find out some background information about that area of the law. Then you'll have to locate the legislation. You should be able to do that with your research skills that you acquired in Introduction to Law. However, from there, you then need to actually delve deeper into the law and have a look at the case law that has interpreted and applied that legislation. So that's where this skill set comes in. We will then move on to looking at regulatory networks and legislative provisions, and this part of the lecture video is designed to target the second assessment in this unit, which is focused on a small law reform project targeted at analysing how the law works and how it can be improved, which will not only help you with your theoretical essay questions that you face in other units, but it will also help prepare you for when you are working in a legal practice or in a community legal centre and you're asked to help prepare a submission to a parliamentary inquiry or a law reform commission on a particular area of the law.
Now, aside from looking at the practical effects of legislation, how it is governed, and how effectively it governs, we also need to locate materials that are connected to legislation. So in this module, I will provide a series of videos on how to note up legislation. What I mean by that is how to find cases that have interpreted or applied legislation, and there is a method of doing it which varies from database to database. So the videos will look at noting up legislation in Westlaw AU, Lexis Advance Pacific, and also OSLI. Now, they will tell you some of the journal articles as well that have referred to legislation. So they don't just list cases, they also look at journal articles, but their coverage is a bit patchy. The databases generally only indicate journals that are within their own database or are from particular publishing houses. So none of the databases are infallible, and you really need to look at all three. But if you do use all three, you will get a broad coverage of academic commentary that has referred to the relevant legislation. But what's really useful is that you can note up what cases have interpreted and applied the legislation, and that can really help you track the interpretation of the law and how it changes over time, how it responds on a practical level, how the court responds on a practical level to the application of the statute.
Moving on to the second topic, which is the critical analysis of regulatory networks and legislative provisions.
We're going to be looking at more than just a statute and attempting to read it and interpret and apply it. Obviously, that's an important part of the research process. You need to know what the law is and how it operates, but we also need to engage in a critical analysis of the law. Statutes are the codification of ideals or objectives into legislation. So you take an idea or an ideal or a particular purpose that a minister or the government wants to achieve, and then you create a series of rules that reflect, or should at the very least, reflect those ideals and objectives. It's our intention to evaluate those rules and ascertain whether or not they are effective at what they do, and if not, why. We need to critically analyse them, consider the system, the way that it works, what doesn't work, and whether reform is necessary. And then, if reform is necessary, how do we go about achieving that? So when we're evaluating legislation, we do so with reference to the social perspective and also its governance. So let's take the social perspective first. We live by a series of rules every day without even thinking about it. Now, some are formal rules, like the road rules, for example, whereas others are informal, like the sporting rules in a football match. Now, some of those rules are more effective than others at ensuring compliance. So if you think about a football match, there are a series of rules enforced by a referee. Some players will do an illegal tackle just in the hope that the referee won't see, they'll get away with it and they'll win the ball, whereas others play by the rules at all times, and the compliance rates can vary from match to match, or maybe from football club to football club. It's the same with legislation. Take the road rules. Some people end up with a lot more speeding fines than others. So you need to consider how effective the relevant statutory provisions are. What are the compliance rates? Think about why people don't comply. What's not working within that system? So going back to the football match, do compliance rates go up if you have more referees on the pitch, for example? Is it the enforcement aspect the problem here? Is that the problematic aspect of the system? Does the system fail? Not because the rules are inadequate, but because it's not sufficiently enforced or resourced? Or is there something else? Do the rules not accurately reflect society's values and ideals? Are they out of step with modern society? And is that what needs to be changed? Once you've looked at the social aspect, you then need to think about governance. What bodies or agencies are involved in regulating this area? Is it very complex? Are there jurisdictional issues? What number of bodies are involved? How effective are those bodies at ensuring that regulation is effective? And what reforms could improve the way that the system operates? Systems often fail to live up to the ideal because they're too complex. They involve multiple agencies or multiple pieces of legislation, which creates duplication and gaps, or there can be enforcement and resourcing issues. So here we're not just looking at what the law says, we're looking at how it functions on a practical level. What organisations or agencies or bodies are behind it, and how efficient are they? What problems are there with governance? Does the system require improvement, and if so, how? An evaluation of the practical implementation and operation of any regimes is an important part of assessing why the law is not working and how it should be improved. Just before you go, I wanted to let you know that I'll be providing you with a series of basic research videos which will talk about how to locate legislation across a range of databases, find things like explanatory memoranda and second reading speeches, and previous versions of the legislation and connected regulations. Now, you should have covered that in first year, so you probably don't need to look at those videos. But what I'm going to do is provide you with a short quiz for you to check your research skills, those basic research skills. If the quiz, when you complete it, indicates that you need to refresh your memory on a particular one of those databases, then make sure that you look at those relevant videos on how to do that.